Hello everyone, welcome to Black Diamond Public School, Gati Katona, Jamui, Bihar. Today is my in-house training program and I am going to explain about storytelling in classroom. I am Shikha, presenting here this topic storytelling in classroom. Storytelling is the social and cultural activity of sharing stories, sometimes with improvisation, theatrics or embellishment. Every culture has its own stories or narratives which are shared as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation or instilling moral values. Crucial elements of stories and storytelling include plot, characters, and narrative point of view. The term storytelling can refer specifically to oral storytelling, but also broadly to techniques used in other media to unfold or disclose the narrative of a story. Historical perspective. Storytelling intertwined with the development of mythologies predates writing. The earliest forms of storytelling were usually oral, combined with gestures and expressions. Some archaeologists believe that rock art, in addition to a role in religious rituals, may have served as a form of storytelling for many ancient cultures. The Australian Aboriginal people painted symbols which also appear in stories on cave walls as a means of helping the storyteller remember the story. The story was then told using a combination of oral narrative, music, rock art, and dance, which bring understanding and meaning to human existence through the remembrance and enactment of stories. People have used the carved trunks of living trees and ephemeral media, such as sand and leaves, to record folk tales in pictures or with writing. forms of tattooing may also represent stories with writing expressions. Some archaeologists believe that rock art, in addition to a role in religious rituals, may have served as a form of storytelling for many ancient cultures. The Australian Aboriginal people painted symbols which also appear in stories on cave walls as a means of helping the storyteller remember the story. The story was then told using a combination of oral narrative, music, rock art, and dance, which bring understanding and meaning to human existence through the remembrance and enactment of stories. People have used the carved trunks of living trees and ephemeral media such as sand and leaves to recorded folk tales in pictures or with writing. Complex forms of tattooing may also represent stories with information about genealogy, affiliation, and social status. Folk tales often share common motifs and themes, suggesting possible basic psychological similarities across various human cultures. Other stories, notably fairy tales, appear to have spread from place to place, implying mimetic appeal and popularity. Groups of originally oral tales can coalesce over time into story cycles, like the Arabian Nights, cluster around mythic heroes like King Arthur, and develop into the narratives of the deeds of the gods and saints of various religions. The results can be episodic, like the stories about Anansi epic, as with Homeric tales. Inspirational, note the tradition of Vaite, and or instructive, as in many Buddhist or Christian scriptures. With the advent of writing and the use of stable, portable media, storytellers recorded, transcribed, and continued to share stories over wide regions of the world. Stories have been carved, scratched, painted, printed, or inked onto wood or bamboo, ivory and other bones, pottery, clay tablets, stone, palm leaf books, skins, parchment, bark cloth, paper like silk and canvas and other textiles are recorded on films and stored electronically in digital form. Oral stories continue to be created improvisation alley by impromptu and professional storytellers as well as committed memory and passed from generation to generation despite the increasing popularity of written and televised media in much of the world. Now another topic is contemporary storytelling. Modern storytelling has a broad preview. In addition to its tradition forms, fairy tales, folk tales, mythology, legends, fables, etc., it has extended itself to representing history, personal narrative, political commentary, and evolving cultural norms. Contemporary storytelling is also widely used to address educational objectives. New forms of media are creating new ways for people to record, express, and consume stories. Tools for asynchronous group communication can provide an environment for individuals to reframe or recast individual stories into group stories. Games and other digital platforms, such as those used in interactive fiction or interactive storytelling, may be used to position the user as a character within a bigger world. Documentaries, including interactive web documentaries, employ storytelling narrative techniques to communicate information about their topic. Self-revelatory stories created for their cathartic and therapeutic effect, which are growing in their use and application as in psychodrama, drama therapy, and playback theatre. Storytelling is also used as a means by which to precipitate psychological and social change in the practice of transformative arts. Some people also make a case for different narrative forms being classified as storytelling in the contemporary world. Like, for example, digital storytelling, online and dice and paper-based role-playing games. In traditional role-playing games, storytelling is done by the person who controls the environment and the non-playing fictional characters and moves the story elements along for the players as they interact with the storyteller. The game is advanced by mainly verbal interactions, with dice roll determining random events in the fictional universe, where the players interact with each other and the storyteller. This type of game has many genres, such as sci-fi and fantasy, as well as alternate reality worlds based on the current reality, but with different setting and beings such as werewolves, aliens, demons, or hidden societies. These oral-based role-playing games were very popular in the 1990s place. Despite the prevalence of computer-based MMORPGs, the dice and paper RPG still has a dedicated following. Now we are coming to next subtopic, which is oral traditions. Oral traditions of storytelling are found in several civilizations. They predate the printed and online press. Storytelling was used to explain natural phenomena. Bards told stories of creation and developed a pantheon of gods and myths. Oral stories passed from one generation to the next, and storytellers were regarded as healers, leaders, spiritual guides, teachers, cultural secrets keepers, and entertainers. Oral storytelling came in various forms like songs, poetry, chants, and dance. Albert Bates Lord, who examined oral narratives from field transcripts of Yugoslav oral bars, collected by Milman Parry in the 1930s, and the texts of epics such as the Odyssey. Lord found that a large part of the stories consisted of text which were improvised during the telling process. Albert Bates Lord identified two types of story vocabulary. The first he called formulas: rosy finger down, the wine that see, and other specific set phrases had long been known of in Homer and other oral epics. Lord, however, discovered that across many story traditions, fully 90% of an oral epic is assembled from lines which are repeated verbatim or which use one-for-one word substitutions from lines which are repeated verbatim or which use one-for-one word substitutions. Like, in other words, oral stories are built out of set phrases which have been stockpiled from a lifetime of hearing and telling stories. Now we discuss the other type of story vocabulary is theme. Theme, a set of sequence of story actions that structure a tale. Just as the teller of tales proceeds line by line using formulas, so he proceeds from event to event using themes. One near universal theme is repetition, as evidenced in Western folklore with the rule of three. Three brothers set out, three attempts are made, three riddles are asked. A theme can be as simple as a specific set sequence describing the arming of a hero, starting with shirt and trousers and ending with headdress and weapons. A theme can be large enough to be a plot component. For example, a hero proposes a journey to a dangerous place, or he disguises himself, or his disguise fools everybody except for a common person of little account, who immediately recognizes him. The commoner becomes the hero's ally, showing unexpected resources of skill or initiative. A theme does not belong to a specific story, but may be found with minor variation in many different stories. The next subtopic is storytelling and learning. Storytelling is a means for sharing and interpreting experiences. Peter L. Berger says, human life is narratively rooted. Humans construct their lives and shape their world into homes in terms of these groundings and memories. that they can bridge cultural, linguistic, and age-related divides. Storytelling can be adaptive for all ages, leaving out the notion of age segregation. Storytelling can be used as a method to teach ethics. Values and cultural norms and differences. Learning is most effective when it takes place in social environments that provide authentic social cues about how knowledge is to be applied. Storage functions as a tool to pass on knowledge in a social context. So, every story has three parts. First, the setup, the hero's world before the adventure starts. Second, the confrontation, the hero's world turned upside down. Third, the resolution, hero conquers villain, but it's not enough for hero to survive. The hero or world must be transformed. Any story can be framed in such format. Human knowledge is based on stories, and the human brain consists of cognitive machinery necessary to understand, remember, and tell stories. Humans are storytelling organisms that both individually and socially lead storied lives. Stories mirror human thought as humans think in narrative structures and most often remember facts in story form. Facts can be understood as smaller versions of a larger story. Thus, storytelling can supplement analytical thinking because storytelling requires auditory and visual senses from listeners. One can learn to organize their mental representation of a story, recognize structure of language, and express his or her thoughts. Stories tend to be based on experiential learning, but learning from an experience is not automatic. Often a person needs to attempt to tell the story of that experience before realizing its value. In this case, it is not only the listener who learns, but the teller who also becomes aware of his or her own unique experiences and background. This process of storytelling is empowering as the teller effectively conveys ideas and with practice is able to demonstrate the potential of human accomplishment. Storytelling taps into existing knowledge and creates bridges both culturally and motivationally toward a solution. Stories are effective educational tools because listeners become engaged and therefore remember. Storytelling can be seen as a foundation for learning and teaching. While the story listener is engaged, they are able to imagine new perspectives, inviting a transformative and empathetic experience. This involves allowing the individual to actively engage in the story as well as observe, listen, and participate with minimal guidance. Listening to a storyteller can create lasting personal connections, promote innovative problem solving, and foster a shared understanding regarding future ambitions. The listener can then activate knowledge and imagine new possibilities. Together, a storyteller and listener can seek best practices and invent new solutions because stories often have multiple layers of meanings. Listeners have to listen closely to identify the underlying knowledge in the story. Storytelling is used as a tool to teach children the importance of respect through the practice of listening, as well as connecting children with their environment through the theme of the stories, and give them more autonomy by using repetitive statements which improve their learning to learn competence. It is also used to teach children to have respect for all life, value interconnectedness, and always work to overcome adversity. To teach like this, a kinesthetic learning style would be used, involving the listeners through music, dream interpretation, or dance. Now, with the help of our video session, we try to understand the topic storytelling in the classroom. Let's watch it.
Into a good story, and at the end of the podcast, the host asked the guest if he could share just a short 5-minute story
as well.
Fantastic. And I don't know if you're up for this, but do you think you could tell like a really short story? It's okay if you're not game for it, but I'd love for people to get a sample of a story, that sort of an example of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, all right. I'll give you the quick version of something.
Okay.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll tell you, I'm going to choose a very small moment. This is about the smallest moment that I can think of to illustrate the point. So I'm leaving the gym. Just a few months ago this happened. I'm leaving the gym, and as I'm coming down the stairs, and I'm feeling really good about myself because I've just exercised for 45 minutes and I've not yet eaten a cheeseburger. So it's this unique time in my life where I have done.
I was listening to a podcast that was all about storytelling and how to be a better storyteller and what goes into a good story. And at the end of the podcast, the host asked the guest if he could share just a short 5-minute story
as well.
Fantastic. And I don't know if you're up for this, but do you think you could tell like a really short story? It's okay if you're not game for it, but I'd love for people to get a sample of a story, that sort of an example of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, all right. I'll give you the quick version of something.
Okay.
Okay, great. All right, so I'll tell you, I'm going to choose a very small moment. This is about the smallest moment that I can think of to illustrate the point. So I'm leaving the gym. Just a few months ago this happened. I'm leaving the gym, and as I'm coming down the stairs, and I'm feeling really good about myself because I've just exercised for 45 minutes and I've not yet eaten a cheeseburger. So it's this unique time in my life where I have done something really good for my body and have not defiled it with fat and carbohydrates yet. I will. I'm on my way actually to a cheeseburger on this day. But this little time in between, I feel good about myself. And I'm heading towards the door, and my keys fall out of my hand. My hands are all sweaty, so they slip out. And as they fall, they sort of land on my foot, like half on my foot and half off. And before I can even bend over to pick them up, this woman coming into the gym, walking in the opposite direction, bends over, picks my keys up off my foot, puts them in my hand, and then just keeps walking. And I can't believe it. I would never pick the keys up off someone's foot. Like, I would never pick up anyone's keys, I don't think. I have a friend who's in a wheelchair, and if he dropped his keys, I honestly would do sort of the trigonometry to determine if he can get his own damn keys or do I have to help him. And this woman has done this for me. She picks up my keys, and then she goes into that little room where she's going to ride a stationary bike to nowhere, while some authoritarian in spandex is going to shout at her for not going nowhere fast enough. And she hasn't waited for a thank you or a gift or a parade, all of which I would have expected had I done something so selfless. And so I'm standing there in front of the smoothie bar with my keys in my hand, and I am thinking about what a horrible person I am, and how just in the last hour, how horrible I have been. Before I got to the gym, I went to the supermarket to get a Gatorade. And as I was walking in, the Boy Scouts were set up in a little table by the door selling candy bars. And I hate that. I hate that they sell candy bars because there's already candy bars in the grocery store too. So it's like putting a hat on a hat. Why are you selling me something that I could get for cheaper, inside the store? And so when I walk up to them, I used to be able to tell them I don't have any cash on me. I would say, oh, sorry, I only have a credit card. But now they have phones. And they say, oh, no, we can take your credit card, no problem. And so now what I do is I pretend that I'm on a phone call. This is what I did on this day. I put the phone to my ear and I pretend I'm talking to my wife and that I'm in this really serious conversation. So as I walk by them, I can sort of wave them off by pointing at the phone and letting them know this is really serious. And then when I leave the grocery store, I actually leave from the opposite way and I walk all the way across the parking lot. I do a full circle just to avoid these kids. And I was a Boy Scout. For all of my childhood, Boy Scouts saved my life in a million ways, and yet I'm not willing to give these kids $1 so they might get to a summer camp someday. And then when I got to the gym, I was walking in and I saw this woman coming sort of diagonally to me towards the door, and I realized that I was going to get to the door about 10 seconds before she was, which was going to require me to hold the door for her. And I hate this too. I hate when I'm ahead of people in the world and then I have to stop and hold doors for them. It makes me crazy. And so what I did to avoid this, I did, again, some mental trigonometry, and I realized if I quicken my pace, I can get to the door maybe 15 or 20 seconds before her, and then I won't be required to hold it anymore. And so that's what I did. I walked faster and slipped through the door and avoided holding a door for another human being. And then when I was done on the treadmill that day, and I think about what a horrible and selfish person I am. Just in that last hour, all those bad things I've done. And so I leave the gym feeling terrible about myself. And so the next day I pull into the gym and it's pouring, it's cats and dogs. And as I'm pulling in, the spot closest to the gym door, there's someone backing out of it. And I'm so excited because I'm not gonna get wet. My kids call it the best spot in the lot. And so I stop and I wait for that car to back out so I can take the best spot in the lot. And as I'm waiting, I see headlights behind me, another car who's pulling in, waiting for me to move out of the way so that they can park probably like 9 miles away at the back of the parking lot. And then as I look back down, I see my keys in the ignition. And I think about the day before with the angel who picked them up. I swear I can still see some of her like angel dust on my keys. And so when that car clears the parking spot and it's my turn to take it, I drive by the parking spot and I park 9 miles away. And I give that spot over to whoever's behind me, probably a serial killer. But whoever it is, they get the spot that day because I decide to be a slightly better person. It doesn't mean I've changed my life in any way. I still hate wiping down treadmills, and I still hate holding doors, and I still dodge the Boy Scouts at every chance that I get. But when I'm holding my keys in my hand, when I'm looking at them, I want to be me that's at least a good start. So that is a story of a tiny little moment that when it happened a few months ago.
And while the podcast up to that point was interesting, it wasn't until this moment that Matthew Dix had told this story that I was kind of starting to buy into this idea of how powerful storytelling can be. Have to be a big event. It doesn't have to be this big monumental moment, stories in social context, but I hadn't actually considered using storytelling as a tool in the classroom. I'm Tom Gibson, and you are listening to Stories from the Classroom, and today we're exploring actual storytelling in the classroom. We'll be looking at what makes a good story and how Matthew Dix uses stories in his classroom. You'll hear me take on my first thoughtful attempt of crafting and telling a story to my students and doing a self-assessment on my story based on the things that I learned from Matthew's book, Storyworthy, as well as have Matthew dissect it in the same way that he does on his podcast. Additionally, we'll hear from an experienced storyteller teacher share one of her stories that she told to a group of freshmen, and then I'll have Matthew talk about what made her story such good storytelling. And so hopefully hearing a novice storyteller like myself followed by an experienced storyteller can kind of give you some insights into what to avoid as well as what it can look like and sound like when it's done really well. And lastly, we'll share some resources for you to become a better storyteller in your classroom. It's like, oh yeah, I love The Moth. But The Moth is an organization that promotes storytelling. They've got a podcast, they put on storytelling competitions, and they've got open mic competitions called Story Slams, of which Matthew Dix has competed in over 70 and has won 39 of them. And from there, they take those winners and have them compete in the Grand Slam championships, of which Matthew has competed in 24 of them, winning 6 of them. So all that to say, the man knows how to tell a good story and wrote the book called Storyworthy on how to craft a good story. And as I was reading through it, I started to feel a little overwhelmed at the amount of things that go into crafting a good story. But what I appreciated was about a third of the way into the book, Matthew shares the few things you should keep in mind that will make your stories better than 90% of the stories that people share.
So I think the fundamental problem people have in storytelling is they think that a story is stuff that happened over the course of time, rather than actually looking for something of meaning that someone might want to hear about. So rather than just speaking chronologically about your day, a story is really about a moment of realization or transformation. It's either I think about the world or myself or other people in a different way, that's a realization, or I transform. I used to be one type of a person, but now I'm another type of person. I think that's what we're looking for when we're looking for a story. And I think those moments of transformation and realization take place almost instantaneously. I call them 5-second moments, because I really do believe over the course of about 5 seconds, we become a new person, or we think in a new way, or we see the world in a new way. And so as a storyteller, my goal is to find moments like those in my life, moments where I suddenly feel differently or see differently or am different in some fundamental way. And that is my story that I'm going to tell. And then in terms of telling it, what I always tell people is I start at the end. I start with the moment. Like that moment of realization or transformation is always going to be the most important thing that I say. Nothing else in my story will ever be as important. So it needs to be the end of my story. Because once I've said the most important thing in my story, people will stop listening. They'll start to drop off very quickly, effectively as possible, with as much context as possible. So that is essentially what I try to do. And I tell people, if you're talking about a moment that means something to you, and you're crafting your story in order to land in that moment effectively, you're doing better than most people.
And it turns out that the movie Jurassic Park is a fantastic model for good storytelling.
Yeah, I'm sort of obsessed with that movie, actually, and all Spielberg movies, to be honest with you. You know, people think about Jurassic Park as a movie about dinosaurs, but if you really pay attention to that film, it's really the story of a man who can't be with the woman he loves completely because she wants to have children and he does not. And right in the beginning of that movie, that is what happens. They have an encounter with a small boy. The man, Alan, sort of treats the boy very poorly. And the woman says, you know, why did you do that? And he says, you know how I feel about kids. They smell, they're expensive, they're stupid. He hates kids. And he says, you want to have one of those? And she says, not that one, but I'd like to have a kid someday. And right there, Spielberg has laid out for us what this story is actually about. It's a relationship between two people that has to somehow change in order for it to work. And over the course of time, it's not surprising to see that Alan ends up in Jurassic Park, running away from dinosaurs, trying to protect two small children at the same time. And as he's protecting these children throughout the course of the movie, he's growing closer and closer to them and starting to understand that children are not smelly and stupid and expensive, but they're actually funny and they're creative and they're problem solvers. And so Spielberg layers all of that, you know, under dinosaurs, because the dinosaurs are what get you to go to the film. Because if I said, hey, you want to go see a movie about a guy who can't fundamentally be with the woman he loves until he learns to love children, and the movie will show us how he learns to love children over time, you'd never go to see the movie. So that is why it's a great movie, though, because it's not just stuff happening. It's not just people running away from dinosaurs. It's people transforming in deep and meaningful ways that we understand, and the dinosaurs are the things that keep us watching.
As I was trying to think of how to actually begin to implement this in my class, I was curious of how storytelling from a stage would look different from storytelling in front of a classroom.
It's not that different, to be honest with you. I have to train the kids not to interrupt me when I'm telling sort of a more formal story. They're not accustomed to that. They all have questions. I guess the biggest difference for me is if I tell a story on the stage, I like to leave some unanswered questions. I like the story to linger with my audience, and an adult audience is willing to accept that. Kids will not accept that. They hate every unanswered question. So at the end of every story I tell in the classroom, I always say, so what questions do you have about the story? And they always want to fill in all the gaps. With adults, I wouldn't let them do it, but with kids, I know it's just going to pester them if I don't. But I tell them the same way. I stand in front of my kids, often on my stage. I say, I'm going to tell you a story now. They get really excited. They love the stories I tell. So it's nice. But it's very, very similar to what I do on the stage.
And so we began to explore what it actually begins to sound like when Matthew is telling stories to his class.
I guess I do it in a lot of ways. One of the things I do is I just tell my kids stories. Part of it is educational. I'm teaching through stories. I'm also teaching stories all the time to teach them to become better writers and speakers. I want my kids to leave my classroom being more interesting as people. I think people tend to fundamentally not be very interesting in the things that they say. And if I can get my kids to understand what a story is, how it works, and how to tell it, and to choose the right things to talk about, because that is critical. I always say I'd much rather hear the right story told poorly than the wrong story told well. I want my kids to go out and become people that others want to listen to. So it works both ways. It's me telling them stories all the time, and them starting to learn to tell better stories, both on the page and sort of on the stage, which I've built a stage into my classroom. So I put them up on stages, on microphones, and have them perform all the time.
Could you kind of share just in the last week, how did you match a story with a lesson that you were wanting to teach to students? Or several stories with several lessons, just so we can get an idea of your thought process?
Sure. Well, I told one this afternoon. It's a big one that I tell to kids every year, for example. So there was a boy about 8 years ago named Jamie who found a spoon in a pile of leaves. And it was right around the time that Lord of the Rings was popular, and he loved it. So he takes the spoon out of the leaves and he calls it the spoon of power. And because it's the spoon of power, I spend the entire day trying to steal it from him. And I fail. He leaves school with the spoon of power at the end of the day. And the next day he comes home, he comes back to school. He's drilled a hole in the spoon, his father has, and he's put a chain around it, and now he's got it around his neck. Like the ring Frodo carries around in Lord of the Rings. Now I can't steal it because he's really made it into a spoon of power. And I tell the kids how Jamie wears it for weeks, and then one day some kid comes in and he's sad because he's discovered his parents are getting divorced. They've told him. And the kid's sad all day, and finally Jamie gets up and he puts the spoon around the kid's neck. And he says, "You need the spoon today more than I do." And it becomes this thing where kids just begin passing the spoon when they need it. Jamie's the caretaker of it, and when he sees a kid nervous before a test, he'll put the spoon on the kid. It becomes this beautiful thing. And then the last day of school, I always say to kids, "Do you have anything you want to say to the class before we, part forever?" And he hands me the spoon, and I try to push it away. I say, "No, I can't take the spoon, Jamie." And he said, "No, it belongs here. I found it here, and it has to stay here at this school. And now you have to put it on kids when they need it." And today I had a kid who needed it. And so it came out. And part of that is creating a culture in the classroom, which my stories do all the time. The funniest thing was one of my students, after I told that story, he said, "Why do you have the craziest kids in your classroom?" And I thought to myself, it's not that I have the craziest kids, it's that I tell you stories about the kids before you. And so this shared history develops, and the kids get the sense that they're going to be part of that shared history, and they will. I'll tell their stories in the future. And that becomes really important to kids. They feel like they're part of something bigger than just, what they're occupying now. So I tell stories for that reason, and to teach those lessons. One of the kids said to me, as we were talking about the story afterwards, he said, "Wow, it's really not hard to feel happy. You just sort of need some little thing to spark your day." And I thought, yes, beautiful, thank you. And I didn't want to sort of hit them over the head with that lesson, but they picked up on that. And so that becomes shared history. But I tell stories in just about every single thing that I teach as well. Today we were talking about Pocahontas. We're reading this great book called Blood on the River. It's a historical fiction. And we were talking about Pocahontas, the Disney version versus the historical version. And it was really interesting because the historical version, she's 10 years old. And Disney does not make her look 10 years old because she's going to marry John Smith. And so the kids are talking about, she's 10. And finally, this girl in my class, she says, she's 10, but Disney makes her look older because it's not cool to marry a 10-year-old. We all laugh about it, And I end up telling a story to the kids about a time when I was 21 and I dated a 30-year-old. Because the kids were like, well, what's, age difference? What's wrong with age difference? I told them the story about how at 21, I dated a 30-year-old, and it did not work because she was mature and I was not. And that's the truth of life, is sometimes people are mature and sometimes people aren't. And I just told them that little story to make them understand that, no, John Smith should not have married Pocahontas, and here's a reason why. Because some kids didn't get it. You know, they're not at the point that they see the horribleness of that. You know, they just see it as, well, you know, if she loved him, what was wrong with that? So I tell stories that way. All of my word problems that I give for math are stories. They're often stories about me, but oftentimes they're stories about my kids too, my students, the legacy that my kids have. So the kid who we always make fun of because she can take it, the kid who has stage fright, that kid will appear in a story. You know, all of the kids' quirks appear as part of the word problem so that those stories become real for the kids. There's rarely a moment that I'm not sort of incorporating story into my day.
One of the biggest have is I don't know where to find good stories or what stories to tell. To which Matthew has a daily practice that he calls Homework for Life that helps him capture and document story-worthy moments.
So Homework for Life is a process I started for myself about 6 years ago, and now I've passed it on to thousands of people. But essentially, it's the idea that at the end of the day, before I go to bed, I ask myself, if I had to tell a story from something that happened today, even if the story that I tell would not be worth hearing, what is my most story-worthy moment of the day? And I write it down. I don't write down the whole story because I think that, you know, processes and habits have to be formed with small actions rather than large ones. So I just use Excel. I stretch the B column of my Excel spreadsheet across the screen, and in that B column, I write down what my story would be. So I've only got room for 3 or 4 sentences. But I'm essentially looking for a moment of transformation or realization as best as I can find it that day. Even if there isn't one of those moments, I force myself to write something down. And over the course of time, what I've discovered is I'm able to find stories where I used to not see stories and where most people don't see stories. And as people have engaged in this process, they have reported back to me by the thousands now that the same thing has happened to them, that they suddenly see their lives in different ways. They can see the stories that they were missing before, thanks to this Homework for Life. And kids do it all the time too. I hear from high school teachers especially all the time who are telling me that their classes are now doing Homework for Life. It's really wonderful.
Do what you do on your podcast with your wife, where you listen to a story, generally someone that is much more experienced than I am on the podcast, and you kind of critique it. We were just coming back from the new semester, and I had one of my students, her class job is to create posters for the classroom, and she was creating this growth mindset poster. And I thought, well, I had a moment kind of earlier in the week where I went to my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class. I'm fairly new to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, only been doing it for like a year and a half. And I wanted to tell a story where I was empathizing with the students about kind of feeling like I don't know what I'm doing and trying to have like this growth mindset. And so I want to do my own self-assessment after we listen to the story and kind of feel where I feel there's weaknesses there. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well. Welcome. So, for those who don't know, I started teaching pre-algebra maybe 5 years ago. And even when I first started teaching pre-algebra, I was learning things here and there because I hadn't actually taught a lot of this content or seen a lot of this content since I was a kid. But as the years progressed, I started learning it and feeling like I really knew pre-algebra content. You're teaching it year after year after year and getting lots of questions from students about some of the same things and learning how to answer those questions. I really felt and really feel that I know pre-algebra. This morning, I go to a jiu-jitsu class at 6 a.m. All right. A student started choking on their spit, so natural interruptions that come with being in a classroom.
This morning, I went to a jiu-jitsu class. I take a jiu-jitsu class at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's a lot like wrestling. It's a type of martial art. I started jiu-jitsu in November of 2017. When I'm there are people that are better than me. There's people that are not as good as me because they're just starting, and I've got about a year under my belt. And there's lots of different types of people. There's a chef that's there a lot of days. He's a professional chef. There's people there that sell cars for a living. There's a barber that goes there. He's in his 50s. And he's a lot better than me because he's been doing it longer than me. And so I was in class this morning, and the head coach, he's a black belt. He's been doing jiu-jitsu for a long time. He's showing us a technique. And he's like, okay, I want you to go with your partners. And so me and the chef, we find an empty spot on the mat, and we're trying to do the moves, and he's trying it to me, and I'm trying it to him. And with jiu-jitsu, you're in these positions where you have a lot of control and a lot of power, but sometimes you're in a position where your opponent has a lot of control and a lot of power, and you're trying to switch that. You're trying to get in a spot where you have control and power. And so we keep trying the moves back and forth, and then we come into a circle. Coach is like, all right, what questions do you guys have? And so one of the guys who's a lot more experienced than me, he asks a question, and the coach is like, it's a good question, show me what you mean, and they actually go through it. And then I start thinking, like, well, I was really struggling with the first part of the move. There's this part where I feel like I don't have the strength that I need to turn the guy over, but everyone else seems to be able to turn him over just fine. And so he asks, any other questions? And I want to ask my question, but I'm like, everyone else seems to kind of understand this, though. So another guy asks a question. A guy is brand new. He started last week. A white belt, and he's like, well, what do you do in this situation? And the coach is like, it's a great question. He starts to break it down a little bit. The coach is like, any other questions? I'm like, I still have my question, but I don't really want to ask it because I don't want to seem like I don't know what I'm doing. And what occurred to me was, I don't like being in a position where I look like I don't know what I'm doing. Even when I'm in a class that's there to show me how to do the things that I don't know how to do. And eventually, I asked the question. He's like, that's a good question, show me. And then he answered my question, and we were able to actually move on, and I wrote it down in my journal, and was like, okay, I'm gonna try to remember that. But I thought, as someone who's in his 30s and has been in the classroom a lot, both as a teacher and a student, I even feel that feeling of like, I don't really want to ask this question. I don't want to show that I've got this mistake or that I've made this mistake. And so it made me empathize with my students, where as much as I try to create an environment like my coach creates, where he's like, what questions do you have? Never tells anyone it's a bad question, never makes anyone feel dumb for asking it. He just accepts the question and helps you out. As much as I try to create that environment for my students, I want my students to know that I can empathize with them. And I know what that feeling's like. And something that I'm gonna try to do every day in jiu-jitsu is to see if I can be the first one to ask the question, instead of having that mental thing, do I ask it? Does everyone understand it? Or am I the only one? To move past that. So my hope is that my students would be courageous in asking those questions, would be courageous in making those mistakes and learning from those mistakes.
And naturally, kids were asking questions afterwards, like, what was the name of the movie you were struggling? Or what was the name of the chef? Or are you talking like that because you're trying to make it sound dramatic for the podcast?
I'm talking in a way that I'm trying to pull you into a story.
This is no math here.
I would say my own assessment of that story, another student in another class ended up asking me, why did you talk about the thing about being a teacher at the beginning? I think I wanted my 5-second moment to be, I don't like feeling like I don't like looking like I don't know what I'm doing or talking about. And so I was like, well, let me talk about an instance where I do know what I'm doing and I do know what I'm talking about. And that's in the realms of education and being a teacher. And so I just don't know if that transition was really smooth. Because I know in a lot of good stories, there just seems to be like, there's like a completely different setting. I'm talking about being in the classroom, but then I'm jumping to my jiu-jitsu class at a different time. And so there's not really that continuity. I'm not sure if all of the details of the fighters and the people that were there were completely necessary. I think I was trying to paint a picture of just the diversity of the group. Just that it wasn't, there was people that were older and people that were younger in all walks of life. Because I felt that was kind of important to kind of just show, like, it's not just like I'm not the youngest one there, but I'm also not the oldest one there. I feel some of the things that I did well was slowing down at my 5-second moment, really emphasizing that point of the story. And I think a lot of the students understood the point of the story and why I was telling it, as we were about to start talking about the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. And it was actually a poster that said, in this class, mistakes are expected, inspected, and respected. And I was going to kind of talk about that. And I wasn't, as you were talking earlier in the interview about like, you want to end with the 5-second story. I kind of ended with the 5-second story, then I kind of explained it, and then I kind of said the 5-second moment again. And so I don't know if I could have rearranged a few things in there to kind of make it kind of land a lot stronger than it did. So that's what I would say, my self-assessment of my first like real like thoughtful go at a story, instead of just like telling a sequence of events.
Right. I thought your assessment was pretty good. I'm going to speak about some of the same things you spoke of, but I'm just going to speak about them differently. So I guess the place I would start is where you start your story. You know, what you do is something I hear a lot of people do that I don't recommend, which is you sort of lay out who you are and how you got here, when really the story is about you in that class, and you being afraid to ask a question and finding the courage to ask it. And so what I would say is you got to get that story off the ground. It takes a long time for the story to get off the ground because you provide us with lots of background information. And ideally in a story, what you want to do is to provide that background information after the story is already moving. So I would have started the story somewhere with, so I'm on a jujitsu mat and I'm trying to flip this, for example. I think you grab our attention and then you can start to talk about yourself. And it's interesting, you talked about the people who you were trying to, they're just flat people that don't serve any purpose in the story. What you want to do is describe those people. You also tell us something about you. So you say, so there's an old guy there. I mean, I'm sure I can kick his butt, except he's been here for 3 years and he can do everything and I can do nothing. You know, and then there's this guy who, you know, is far cooler than I will ever be. Keep the story centered on yourself. If you ever want to add humor to a story, that's the place to add it. When you can provide contrast, contrast is always funny. So you find the guy who's stronger than you and compare him to you, and that'll become funny. You find the smallest person in the room who is able to kick your ass, and that becomes funny. You know, you find those kinds of people, and then you're able to describe yourself effectively and give us people at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then at the end of the story, I guess what I would suggest as a teacher is I would stop my story before I'd start talking about my students. I would leave my story off in the jujitsu parlor. What is it called?
The jiu-jitsu gym, club, mats.
Okay. I would leave it there, and I would stop the story, and I would say, what does that story mean to you guys? And I would, through clever questions and maybe some great insight on your students' part, I would get them to say what you want them to say, which is, oh, I feel like that sometimes in class when I have a question, but I don't want to ask it because I feel like an idiot. Or I feel that way in class when I know I've made a mistake, but I don't want anyone to know I made a mistake. You know, or I get a test back and I don't want to share the score with anyone because I know it makes me look terrible. So I would get the kids.
I hope with the help of this video, you aware about how to explain story in classroom. So for today, that's all. Thank you.